Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Hmm.
Today, we're going to be looking into two really captivating true crime cases, and these cases both come from articles on A&E True Crime. And, as we go through this, you'll start to see there are some really intriguing parallels between these stories, even though they're from completely different times. One case is about the origins of the rape kit, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a tool that revolutionized evidence collection in sexual assault cases. The other case delves into a really controversial murder trial from the 1950s, the case of Barbara Graham. And both of these cases, they involve innovative approaches to evidence, but the outcomes and the ethical considerations are vastly different. So I think this can be pretty fascinating.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me about both these stories is that they feature these individuals who are just way ahead of their time.
Mm-hmm.
People who really pushed for change in the justice system. We're talking about Marty Goddard, the driving force behind the creation of the rape kit,
Yeah.
and Barbara Graham, whose trial ended up raising these serious questions about how evidence is actually gathered and used.
Yeah, it's really amazing to me when I was reading this how much Marty Goddard accomplished. She was just working a regular job at a foundation when she sort of stumbled upon this hidden epidemic of child abuse.
Right.
And it all started because she was volunteering at a teen runaway hotline.
Yeah, and that's really where her story kind of takes off, Goddard. She starts to understand that a lot of these runaways weren't just, seeking adventure. They were escaping abuse that was happening in their own homes. What she did next was really remarkable. I mean, instead of just, being overwhelmed by this whole tragic situation, Goddard, she took action and set out to create a solution, a way to gather evidence in sexual assault cases where before there was none.
Wow.
It was about giving survivors a voice through physical evidence.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about the physical kit, right? The article mentions that Goddard was also fighting this cultural battle at the time. I mean, the common belief back then was that women often lied about rape and that their testimonies weren't reliable. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been for her?
Absolutely. She was up against this deeply ingrained societal bias. For the kit to even be effective, Goddard knew she had to change how society viewed survivors, especially law enforcement. She wanted to create a world where their experiences were taken seriously and where their accounts, were no longer automatically dismissed as hysterical or fabricated.
And can you believe how she actually got the kit widely adopted? She trademarked it under a male police officer's name.
Wow.
I mean, talk about strategic thinking.
Yeah, it speaks to Goddard's, really deep understanding of the system and her willingness to kind of work within its existing power structures.
Yeah.
It was a pragmatic decision that ultimately led to wider acceptance of the kit. But it also brings up this interesting point. The article mentions that the rape kit itself hasn't really changed much in the past 50 years.
Really?
Yeah. It's essentially the same paper box it was back then. So it really makes you wonder why there hasn't been more innovation, especially with all the advancements we've seen in forensic science, things like DNA analysis and digital forensics.
Yeah, it's almost like we've become complacent.
Right.
And it's not just about the kit itself, is it? The article also talks about the difficulties survivors still face today.
Oh, for sure.
Finding a hospital that can administer the exam, maybe waiting for hours in an emergency room, and then going through a long and invasive procedure. I mean, it's a lot to go through.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that progress isn't always linear. And even with groundbreaking tools like the rape kit,
Yeah.
there's still a long way to go. The article does mention some potential solutions being explored, things like mobile units and telemedicine, to make the process less intimidating and more accessible.
Yeah.
What do you think about those? Do those strike you as viable options?
Yeah, I definitely think they have potential, especially for, those in rural areas or those who might have difficulty with transportation or childcare. Anything that makes the process less daunting and more survivor-centered has got to be a step in the right direction. But it makes me wonder, even if we solve that access issue, can we ever really be sure that the evidence collected is always going to be handled ethically and used fairly? I mean, Barbara Graham's case shows us how things can go wrong even when physical evidence exists.
That's a crucial connection to make. Despite being decades apart, both the story of the rape kit and Barbara Graham's case raise these really fundamental questions about how we pursue justice. You're absolutely right to bring up Barbara Graham because her case, it really highlights how messy this whole pursuit of justice can be. The article about her on A&E True Crime really paints this picture of a woman who was just caught up in this media frenzy and facing a legal system that seemed determined to just make an example of her. It's a story that raises a lot of questions about, how evidence is used and how public perception can influence the outcome of a trial.
Yeah, it's hard not to be struck by the way the media portrayed Barbara Graham. The murder she was accused of was undeniably brutal, but the way she was portrayed as, bloody Babs in the press is pretty unsettling. It's like they already decided she was guilty before she even, stepped foot in a courtroom.
Right. The media's role in shaping public perception is something we really need to pay attention to even today. You know, the sensationalized headlines, the focus on her appearance and her past, it all contributed to this environment where it was almost impossible for her to get a fair hearing. It's like a textbook example of how prejudice and these snap judgments can really undermine the pursuit of justice.
And then you have the testimony of John True, her alleged accomplice. At the time, his account seemed pretty damning, placing Graham right there at the scene of the attack.
And that's where the work of Marcia Clark, the former prosecutor, becomes so fascinating. She reviewed the trial transcripts and uncovered something really shocking, a hidden witness statement from John True that completely contradicted what he said on the stand during the trial.
Wait, so the prosecution knew about this statement, but they didn't share it with the defense?
It's a serious ethical violation. The prosecution has a duty to disclose any evidence that could be favorable to the defense, especially something as potentially impactful as a conflicting statement from a key witness. It's a fundamental principle of due process.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if the defense had been able to challenge True's credibility using that statement.
Yeah.
Could the whole case have gone differently?
It's certainly possible. It raises serious doubts about the foundation of the verdict. Was it based on this genuine search for the truth, or was it more about securing a conviction no matter what?
And then on top of all of that, there's the whole situation with the undercover officer, Sam Sirianni, and this bizarre fake alibi scheme. It's like they were trying to set her up using this fellow inmate, Donna Prow, as bait.
The tactics used in this case are very disturbing. Sirianni's involvement, which was orchestrated with the full knowledge and approval of both the police and the prosecution, raises some serious ethical questions about, what is considered acceptable conduct when you're trying to get a conviction.
And then Prow vanishes right before the defense has a chance to call her to testify. It all seems so suspicious, almost like a cover-up.
Right. The disappearance of a witness who could have potentially corroborated Graham's claims of being pressured into seeking this false alibi, it just adds another layer of doubt to the integrity of the whole process. It's a pattern of behavior that really undermines this whole idea of a fair and impartial justice system.
As we're talking about all of this, I'm kind of reminded of what we discussed earlier about the challenges faced by sexual assault survivors. The pressure on Barbara Graham to confess, even if it meant, making up a story that could further incriminate her. It's oddly similar to the pressure that's often placed on victims to recant their stories or risk not being believed.
That's a really insightful connection. In both situations, you see how power dynamics and societal biases and this desire for a quick resolution can overshadow a genuine search for the truth. It's a reminder that progress can be really slow, and that even with tools like the rape kit, the fight for a truly just system, it's a fight that continues.
It's amazing to think about how these two cases are, decades apart, but they're connected by this common thread of evidence and justice. On the one hand, you have Marty Goddard, who really revolutionized the way we approach these sexual assault cases by creating the rape kit. But then you have Barbara Graham's story, which shows us how easily things can go wrong. Even when you have physical evidence, the system itself can be flawed.
Yeah, you've hit on a key point there. Goddard's legacy is one of incredible progress, but it's also a reminder that the pursuit of justice, it requires us to be vigilant. The rape kit was a huge step forward. But Barbara Graham's case, it serves as a stark reminder that tools and procedures alone aren't enough. Justice ultimately depends on the people who are using those tools and their commitment to fairness and their willingness to acknowledge and address their own biases.
It seems like we've come a long way in terms of recognizing the importance of evidence collection and, taking a more sensitive approach to survivors. But the fight for a system that's truly blind to prejudice and genuinely dedicated to finding the truth, that seems like a fight that's far from over.
Yeah, exactly. We can't just assume that progress is a given. Cases like Barbara Graham's, even though they happened so long ago, they hold these valuable lessons for us today. They remind us that the potential for injustice, it exists within any system. It's our responsibility to hold those in power accountable, to demand transparency, and to constantly question the status quo.
This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. It's made me think about, the role each of us plays in pushing for a more just system. It's not just about supporting survivors and speaking out against injustice. It's also about educating ourselves, understanding how the legal system works, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
I completely agree. It's about encouraging critical thinking and pushing for decisions that are based on evidence, and recognizing that justice, it's not a finish line. It's a journey that demands constant effort and vigilance.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what do you think is the most important thing our listeners should take away from all of this?
I think the core message here is that the pursuit of justice, it's a collective responsibility. We all have a role to play in building a system that is fair and equitable and truly dedicated to uncovering the truth. And that starts with awareness, understanding the historical context, and acknowledging the systemic challenges that still persist. But it also requires action, whether it's supporting organizations that advocate for survivors, pushing for policy changes, or simply having those tough conversations about bias and injustice within our own communities. Every effort matters.
Well said. Knowledge is power, but it only truly makes a difference when we put it into action. So for our listener out there, I encourage you to learn more about Marty Goddard's work and the ongoing efforts to make rape kits more accessible and provide better support for survivors. And as you think about Barbara Graham's case, ask yourself, how can we create a system where everyone, regardless of their background or their circumstances, has a fair chance at a trial that's really focused on finding the truth, not just getting a conviction?
It's a question worth pondering. The pursuit of justice is an ongoing conversation, a constant evolution. By engaging in these conversations, by questioning, by demanding better, we can collectively work toward a more just and equitable future.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.